Oddly enough, that is still a vast improvement over my introduction last year from Jake, where it was you're going to vomit information onto the audience. So you're doing good, Jake. You're learning. So my name's Matt Gaunt. I'm a developer advocate on the Google team, yeah. And I'm from London, hence the accent. I'm not Rob Dodson. And I'm going to be talking about fundamentals of mobile web development. So the way I want to frame this talk is just really briefly looking at what we've been hearing about today. So we've looked at performance from the Silk team, hitting 60 FPS all the time. Service worker, so the ability to actually offline your web page. Some of the things that are going to be coming off the back of that, background sync, push notifications, the fact that all of this needs TLS, and Polymer, like entirely new way of building your web apps. And this is actually a really exciting time to build for the web, right? Like, all of these new APIs are awesome. And then when you add all of that on what we already have with WebRTC, WebAudio, WebGL, like, this is really exciting. But if you're actually new to web development, or let's say you've been doing web development for a while, but the idea of responsive web design or developing for mobile is actually a bit scary to you, then all of these new APIs is probably going to be pretty daunting. I mean, I think it was Paul Kinlan, he did some research over the top 1,000 websites on Alexis, and I think it was over 30% didn't have a mobile viewport. And when you talk to some of these agencies and companies and developers, the thought of responsive web design is still really new to them. They don't quite understand it. And for them, if you take all of these new features, building for the web probably feels a bit like this. And you can kind of understand why. Like, you're new to it. You kind of feel like you might have your feet in the ground, or you completely don't. You're completely fresh. But this is overwhelming. And nobody wants this to happen to them, ever. And it's kind of interesting, because we're still building on top of this core set of technologies. It's still HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We're just using it in different ways or different scenarios. And I mean, even if you take a step back from all of this, and you think about how you're going to approach these new APIs, everyone's going to do the same thing. You're going to learn about them. You're probably going to start building something using it. And then you're going to iterate on that thing, probably changing it to fit your use case or whatever it might be. And we started thinking, well, if someone actually came to us and said, well, how do I build a responsive mobile site? And they said, where do I go? What do I do? What do I learn? How do I do this? What's the approach? We kind of thought about it, and we realized we didn't have a good answer. Like, realistically, you've got specs, there's blog posts. Some of them might be up to date, some of them might not. And we figured, actually, there's something that we can do here to help. So back at the very start of this year, we came up with the notion of web fundamentals. And this is basically a set of documentation which is built around use cases. So, for example, how do you build a responsive mobile site? And the idea with this is that we'd basically get someone who wanted to learn a particular thing, jump in, learn the best practices as fast as possible, and just get running with it. So, start this year, we started working on it, and we started iterating really, really fast. And we kind of got a couple of months in, and we realized we were at a point where we could release something. And we really wanted to do it as soon as possible to figure out whether we were kind of answering a question that no one was answering. So we got to a stage where, yeah, we're going to release it. And what we did was we just published the website. We made no noise because we didn't want the attention, because if it was a point where no one actually wanted this stuff and they didn't like it, then it could be like, OK, it was an experiment, we tried it, and it didn't quite pan out. And we were doing some work with RGA, who were basically designing the site for us and building it for us so we could focus on the content. And I think Phil Hawksworth kind of summed up how the launch went in this respect. Discovering that not all soft launches are equally soft, and embracing the resulting crowdsourced QA. And basically, what happened with this was the fact that we launched the site. It very quickly got picked up by Twitter, blogs, Hacker News. We got a ton of traffic that we weren't expecting. You'll also notice that it's largely me, Kinlan, and Paul Lewis are taunting him with, what do you mean? And it was really great, because what we found is that we had a GitHub link at the top to just basically encourage people to raise issues. And what we got was people complaining about typos where we'd done stupid things. Also, a lot of people complaining about the fact that we'd written it in British English. But then we also had a ton of issues around people who are actually experts in their field. So one of the scenarios is I'd written some documentation around touch. And I was writing guidance around, if you were supporting mouse and touch, you should probably be using active, hover, and focus. Good practices. You should do it. And PPK read through this documentation. He actually sat there and said, you've said people should be using hover. That's fine. But you don't mention the fact that if you touch something, when you actually let go, the hover state sticks. Now, my first thought was, WTF, why is that sticking? But the other part, I hadn't noticed it because I'd always used focus as well. So this was really handy for two reasons. One, he was an expert in the field. He just jumped in and said, actually, you need to add this in. It's best practices, and you have to tell people about this. Update the docs. It's in. Good to go. The other part is then I can go and complain to Chrome engineering going, why are we doing this? Is there any way we can not do it? Because I can't hover on my mobile phone and do something with it. So the whole point of Web Fundamentals is its best practices, and we're still adding documentation onto it. But one of the important distinctions to make with all this documentation is its fundamental practices. So if you take something like Service Worker, that's not going to land on Web Fundamentals anytime soon, purely for the fact that it's brand spanking new, which means that there aren't best practices. I think everyone that's actually played with Service Worker has done something a little bit different, something that works for them. So to be honest, the idea of best practices and defining them right now, they don't exist. People are still figuring them out. But it's also important to point out that they're use case led. So you would never really land on Web Fundamentals and say, oh, there's a doc on how to implement Service Worker. What it would be is how to implement offline web apps. So the main reason I say this is if someone writes an article like Jake did for App Cache, and there's a new API, then we can actually swap out. And then as time changes, APIs come and go, we can have this same document structure and change the best practices over time. And one of the main reasons we wanted this really quick feedback loop is because we were opinionated in all the docs. If you read something like the tooling section and you take a typical kind of heated discussion, shall we say, within the web development community, like Gulp versus Grunt, we just pick one. We make an informed decision out of all of the available tools, and we pick the one that we think is going to fit most use cases. Now, the main reason for this is if you're a new developer and you don't know what Gulp or Grunt is, you've never had a build process of your own, chances are you don't want the choice because you'll quickly land in this choice paralysis of everyone telling you one thing versus the other. And the flip side of this as well is if you land on the docs and you go, I disagree with you right here, chances are you know enough about this to make an informed decision anyway, so you should run with that. But there was one massive issue with what we'd done with Web Fundamentals, and that was the fact that we didn't help with building stuff. It's a set of documentation. You can still get really overwhelmed by all of this. And this is where we came up with Web Starter Kit. And the idea behind this was that all the best practices that we can actually just hand over to a developer go in here. And it's kind of interesting talking to people because they get a bit, it's difficult to define what Web Starter Kit is because we didn't necessarily do a great job of explaining it because we basically wanted to get the feedback to figure out what people wanted us to do with it. And the way I kind of think of it is, if you create a new web project, there's probably a couple of things you do by default. For me, it's always, I end up building something with Grunt and Gulp. I just start adding that in because it just takes care of a ton of tasks for me and it's good to use. I also just end up copying and pasting something from an old website in terms of the header and the footer just because I can't be bothered to remember it. It's true. But the other side of it is then I probably either define a set of styles just to make things look OK, or I just go and grab something like Bootstrap or Foundation, because ultimately I just want something that kickstarts the look and feel, and then I'll change it afterwards if I want to. So this was the aim of Web Starter Kit. So out of the box, we come with Gulp. And we do a set of tasks with this. So with your styles, we have CSS and Sass support. And we concatenate, which means just two files, smash them together, which means when the browser has to go and fetch your CSS, it's fetching one file rather than 5. It's just easier and more efficient in terms of getting everything to the browser. And we minify it so the files are actually smaller, faster to actually get to the device. And it's been really interesting because while I use Sass every day, most people actually get to a point when they're new to this, they don't want to install Ruby, they don't want to install Sass on top of that. So in the next version of Web Starter Kit, we're going to drop the requirement for Sass altogether. We're going to make it an optional thing, so by default, no Sass, but if you add it in, we'll be using Node Sass. So basically, it's an NPM module, there's no additional dependency. JavaScript, minify and concatenate again, because it's efficient. We also use JSHint out of the box. So if you're a brand new developer, I think this is probably a little bit scary because you suddenly get this thing that goes, actually, a JavaScript, you need to fix these set of issues. But it's incredibly useful. It catches really simple errors, and plus it encourages the education of best practices in JavaScript. Images is an interesting one because how many of you guys have heard of PageSpeed Insights? OK, a fair few. So PageSpeed Insights looks at your site and basically analyzes the, essentially the load time performance of your page. And one of the things it looks for is image compression. And at Google I/O, we had a device lab like we had, and we got to a point where people come up and say, I want to see my website across all the things. And we kind of, me and Pete LePage, who were manning the station, we got to a point where we said, OK, we'll put it on all these devices if you let us analyze every single part of your site and kind of point out where you could be doing better. And images, it was horrifying the number of people that just didn't minify images. And these aren't even like just pet projects. These are like proper companies spending lots of time on their mobile sites. And this thing can save you like 50, 60, 70% on just a single image. So yeah, we've just put that in there. It's best practice. And then we've also got a style guide. And the initial intention with this was that out of the box, if you just wanted to get going, you'd have a good set of styles. And then if you, over time, we'd hope that you jump in Style Guide, customize it, do whatever you want, rip bits out, put stuff in, and it would be yours. And developers actually really like this. They like the notion of splitting content from style. I don't know whether it's term Style Guide-driven development, but that's generally how people kind of refer to it. But the problem with the current version of this is it's horrible to actually change. Like, it's great. A lot of people would just jump in and use it, but tweaking it is a pain because we've got all these dependencies in Sass, and it's not all that good. I'm going to talk about what we're going to change with that in a minute. But first, there's two other tools that we added in to Web Starter Kit. And basically, the minute you start a development server with gulp-serve, it adds in live reload. Now, have you seen any of my talks in the past? I friggin' love live reload. I still occasionally see professional web developers make a change, go into the browser, hit refresh, occasionally hit Control-Shift refresh because the cache is taking effect, and it genuinely, yeah, it drives me insane. But basically, what it does is you make a change in HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, and then it will instantly reload the page for you. And you get this really nice development workflow because you can just stay in your editor, make the changes that you want, and you immediately see them take effect. But one of the other tools that we've added in is Browser Sync. Now, Browser Sync is this weird little thing that if you have a set of devices and browsers pointing to your local development server, any interaction that you do on one of those pages gets synced across all the other devices. So this is like tapping, scrolling. You can input text, and all of them get matched across the devices. Now, this is really handy if you've got like different platforms, different browsers, different screen sizes, just sat next to you on your desk, maybe like a tablet and a couple of different versions of different OSs. This is really useful because you can just stay at your computer doing whatever you need to do and then checking all the parts of your page just from your development machine. So you don't have to muck around with each one. So that's what we have in Web Starter Kit today. And I kind of mentioned that we're going to drop Sass support. That seems to be quite a big one that people want to change. But the other one was this style guide. And the biggest issue with this that I see is the fact that A, it's super unfriendly, and B, we get to this point where it was getting unmanageable, even for us. So we needed to properly strip it back and just figure out, OK, we need to undo all this dependency. And we got to a point where like, we should just start again. Because basically, it's a style guide that we inherited from Web Fundamentals. And we got to this point where we realized that actually a lot of the people using Web Starter Kit, they also had a lot of requirements around browser support. A lot of these developers were at a point where they needed to support older browsers. And then we kind of realized, well, that's normally a gating factor on Polymer. And we figured, well, if we're going to do a style guide, we could to use the material design spec and bring it to some of the older browsers. So this is like a super early cut of what we currently have. And essentially, it's just a material design-inspired style guide. It's got the usual things that you'd expect, typography, lists, of course. I really like this bit because it's like a rainbow. Obviously, because you've got the material design spec, you have to have the buttons with all the ripples. My personal favorite is the text field, and I just love the animations with the underlines. And then when you get to the next one, the label goes up. And we just basically have a set of default boiler components. But the really nice thing with this is behind the hood, it's so much easier than what we had before. You can literally jump into this and understand that if you wanted to change something with the buttons, ooh, I'm breaking things. Yeah, if you wanted to just change one of the buttons, you can actually just find it really clearly in this new structure because it's literally like button folder, button.sas. Easy. But it's really interesting, in the process of this, what we realized is that the material spec isn't necessarily geared towards standard web design. Like if you think of a stereotypical website, header, set of links. That's pretty much web design 101. I guarantee all of you have implemented a website exactly like that at some point in your life. And yeah, there wasn't anything in the material spec that just did this. So we've been working in the material design team just kind of like, what does this pattern look like in material design? And they've been great because something simple as this, we've just got a couple of variations. So just bog standard kind of bar with the links on the right, centered horizontal navigation where we've got kind of like the content embedded within it. If you look at the material design spec, you also have like static navigation, which is where you have the left nav bar hidden away on mobile, but then it's constantly pulled out when you're on desktop. And the idea with all of this is then you obviously get back into the standard hamburger menu with the side nav. But it's been interesting, the fact that we actually hit this problem where it wasn't built for content sites. So it's been an interesting kind of process getting to that point. And I wouldn't be surprised if we hit another couple of points like this where actually we need to work with the material design team to actually bring in these new kind of design patterns. And we've been really fortunate because we have a couple of Chrome UX designers in London, and they happen to unfortunately sit near us, so we can basically tempt them in to come and help us with things. And Hannah and Ed have been great because they took one look at our style guide and they probably died a little bit inside. We're like, what are you doing? But Hannah's put together this amazing mock, which is basically how she thinks the style guide will be used. So rather than have like checkboxes and buttons, that should really be grouped into a form. That's how it's going to be used. And I very roughly started putting this together, hence the bacon ipsum. But it's an interesting point. The fact that style guides should be kind of getting to this point where it helps you and encourages you to use it in a particular way. So we're going to be including things like just copy to clipboard so you don't have to worry about finding a particular snippet hidden away somewhere else. And that brings us on to this iterate step. Because Web Fundamentals should help you with learning. Web Starter Kit should help you with building and starting a brand new project. And the minute you get to iterating, this is where DevTools basically comes into its own. And I guarantee all of you probably have opened up DevTools. So the DevTools team have been making a ton of changes that basically help you with mobile web development, as well as figure out what the browser's doing. So the first one is this device mode, which is basically this blue mobile icon on the top left. Now, the first thing to call out are these bars just above where the website is. These are basically an indication of just where your media queries are on the page. Now, the really useful thing with this, if you get to a point where you've got a ton of media queries in your page, perhaps you're doing it by component, you can actually realize where you might have conflicting media queries and things might get a bit messy. And there's a good chance that there might be something wrong within those patches because you've got so many things overlapping. The other part of this that you've probably all seen before, just put in a nicer way, is this device selection, where basically you select a particular device, and it will set the width and height of that particular device, including the screen density, which is really nice because you get to this point where if you're using responsive images, you'll actually see all of it. But one of my particular favorites is this new network throttling. Now, what this is you can basically select a particular network type that you want to emulate within your browser, and then it will just apply it for you. So here, if I select 2G, do a refresh of the page, and this is a pretty solid indication that I need to do something with that image at the top, because that's kind of painful for a 2G user. But the nice thing with this is actually embedded in DevTools. So this is the point where you're already trying different things out. Before, you'd have to pull out a different application. Depending on which one you use, sometimes they're actually a bit fiddly to work. I actually once managed nearly to lock myself out of my machine because I'd applied it to my entire machine to actually have the slowest network connection I could think of. At that point, my machine decided to lock, and then also decided it needed to phone home to make sure that I was actually still legitimately working here. I can't remember how I got out of it, but it was not a pleasant experience, I can tell you. But at least with this, it's just built straight in, and it's really easy to change. So the other area of a ton of changes in timeline, in DevTools, is timeline. So if I just refresh the page, what I've got is just essentially a timeline of what the current page rendering is doing. And we always get this typical waterfall of what the browser's done. But one of the first new additions is Paint Profiler. So here I've just selected the paint on the page, and it looks fairly hefty. But down below, what you've got is this new Paint Profiler tab. Now what this is along the left, we have a set of draw commands. This is basically what the browser's doing to paint these particular things to the screen. So as I scroll down, we should get to a point where you can actually start to see where these paint commands are actually painting stuff on the page. Along the top here, we also have a representation of how each one of those commands have happened and how long they took to actually occur. And then right in the center, we have this big bad boy, which is basically what the browser's actually painted. Now, the really nice thing with this is if I select a small chunk of the instructions from the paint, as I start to scrub along, you can actually see what the browser's painting and how it's painting it. So if you ever get to a point where you've got this huge long paint and actually it's really causing you issues, this is the first time you can actually really dig down into what the browser's doing under the hood. But admittedly, you have to have an issue that warrants that huge paint. But what happens if the browser could tell you, well, this paint has happened, and then also give you an idea of why the hell it's actually done it? So if I go to our trusty Chrome developer website, I should hopefully find a paint that looks a little something like that. Now, I genuinely find timeline confusing at the best of times, and I also find it even more confusing to figure out what the browser's doing when it decides to do it. So when I see a paint like this, where there's just a blue block, there's a bit of me that questions why it's painting a blue block when it's probably always been there. So in the Paint Profiler, this is all you'd get. But if you move to details, right down the bottom, we have this style invalidations. And basically, what this is telling you now is the fact that it's this particular element on the page that has been painted, and the reason why it's been painted is animation. Now, this is really nice because before, you'd run a timeline, you'd have to be a master of the dark art like Mr. Paul Lewis, understand what the hell is going on because you know what the browser's doing under the hood. This is the first time DevTools is actually going, I've painted, here's the reason why I've done it. And it's kind of nice with this demo because I can actually click on this and you see styles being added. So you can actually see the style invalidation and where the paint's happened. But still thinking along those lines, if we go back to another part of this timeline, you can see we've got this recalculate and this layout. Now again, not being a master of the dark art of timeline, I genuinely still don't know why that would happen. So if I scroll down to the bottom of this layout, we've also got layout invalidations. And this is another scenario where DevTools is actually saying, this particular thing has happened, here's why. So here we can actually get a stack trace that's basically saying cds.card.callProperties is resulting in this particular layout happening. And it also has a list of the components that's basically being laid out as a result of this. Now, this is really useful because before, you were kind of left high and dry to figure out what was going on. Now you can actually get a bit more of an indication of where your code is resulting in the browsers doing some kind of action. Now, I don't know about you, but there comes a point where if I'm looking at a waterfall, it kind of just becomes a lot of pretty colored bricks. And the thing that really kind of confuses me is if I take something like this, I kind of see that the layout and the recalc style have happened, and this yellow block kind of tells me that it's my JavaScript that's done something. But this isn't a really good, clear picture of what's happening, why it's happening, and how long each piece is taking. It's just a colored brick. And this is where the new flame chart viewer comes in. And basically, as you zoom in, you get a bit of a better picture as to animation frame took this amount of time. Within that, your JavaScript was actually the majority of the time spent in it. And something inside this resulted in recalculate style and a layout. Now, it's exactly the same information, but it's just displayed in a different way. But the nice thing with this is you can actually start seeing a bit more of a cause and effect. But admittedly, this still doesn't actually help me figure out what is it in cds.min that caused calculate style followed by a layout. So wouldn't it be kind of handy if you could actually figure out a bit more about what's going on? And this is where JS Profiler comes in. So if I go back and repeat this same thing. So here I've now enabled the JS Profiler along the top. If I go and find this animation frame again, some of you may have noticed that the thing looks suddenly a lot longer and scarier now. But here we've got the animation frame fired, followed by that exact same function call of something in our JavaScript. But you'll notice a couple of bars in, and suddenly we've got this cds.card.expand, followed by cds.card collect properties. And it's that method that's actually resulted in the recalc style and the layout. So this is really useful because now you're actually at a point where you don't have this magical black box of you did something and now I did something too. It actually goes, well, you did some stuff, this was all fine. The minute you hit this method, this is what happened. So it's actually starting to surface up a ton of stuff. Yeah, there we go. And this is really nice because normally you'd get to this point where actually you'd realize maybe you measured offset top or something. But unless you know that's a problem, it's pretty hard to diagnose that. Whereas this goes, this method, something here does something fishy. And that at least reduces your entire search down to a much smaller surface area to try and figure it out. So one of the other new cool things, again, still in the vein of DevTools surfacing information, is you'll notice in the Flame Viewer, we get to this point where we have these kind of weird bobbly things along the top with some kind of time in it. Now, what these represent are frames. Admittedly, my website is awful because by the looks of those frames, it's definitely not hitting 60 FPS. But we'll look past that just for a minute. But when you actually click on one of these frames, you get this layers panel down the bottom. Now, how many of you guys are happy when I say the notion of composite layers? Oh, wow. So Jake actually gave an amazing analogy of this. Of if you had a wall and you had to paint a stick man moving from left to right, you could draw with a marker on the wall a stick man, paint over it, draw the stick man again, paint over it, and repeat until you get to your final destination. What you could do is have transparent plastic on wheels, draw the stick man once, and then just move it across the wall. And the idea of a composite layer is you basically draw everything on a transparent layer to move across. And it's more efficient. It just loads it in the GPU and you're good to go. So what this layers panel does is it actually tells you everything that's been promoted to a layer. Whereas before it was kind of, you'd have some orange borders that might tell you. Now it's really explicit. Now, the other side of this as well is you can see on the right-hand side, yeah, it's your right-hand side, composite reasons. Now, this is great because sometimes you get to a point where something would be promoted to a layer you didn't mean it to. Other times you want it to be promoted to a layer, this tells you it's not. But if you have something and you don't know quite why it's being promoted to a layer like this thing, composite reasons will tell you why it's made that decision. So in this case, overlaps with other composite content cannot be squashed since this layer scrolls with respect to the squashing layer. I didn't intend for this to happen. Ironically, this causes a bug on Android for Chrome where when you scroll it off the screen, it doesn't become a layer anymore and things go a bit funky. But this is actually the first time I've debugged it because you can actually see all the layers. And the nice thing with this is as you start clicking through each of the frames, you should start seeing the layers move. But because I'm so janktastic, of course you don't see the frames. But if it was a good demo, it would have worked. But again, the nice thing with the composite reasons is, again, DevTools is actually explaining what it's done and why it's done it. Now, as good speaker, I have backups to all of these because when you have Paul Irish telling you don't update Canary, it will break your demos, you have videos for backups. So yeah, that's what we're doing on the Chrome team. Web fundamentals to help you with learning, Web Starter Kit to help you build new projects, and DevTools is adding a ton of new features to help you with mobile web development, as well as understanding what the browser's doing. So that way, when you hit this problem of not hitting 60 FPS, it's actually easier for you to diagnose the problem. So thank you very much for listening. Hope it's been useful. Cheers.